So I'm going to ask my co-panelists, the three gentlemen, to actually come up here slowly. They don't have to rush, because while they're coming up here, I'll give you a quick overview of what it is that we're going to be talking about this morning. Hopefully many of you have been motivated enough to actually read the blurb that's on the agenda and on the website for CyCon. And that gives you an overview of why it is that we need to discuss quantum computing. So quantum computing really realistically is poised to be the single biggest advance in the digital information age. And of course, anyone working in artificial intelligence would probably argue that AI is, of course, the big advance. But we can at least perhaps agree that we tie for first place in that regard. And the reason that quantum computing is becoming so important, or will be so important, is that it rests on the ability, and this is demonstrated at least on a small scale empirically, but the ability to solve certain specific problems that are otherwise intractable on classical computers. So intractable means that it costs a vast amount of money and potentially a vast amount of time to actually solve the problem. And you may ask why that's interesting in itself. Well, it turns out that most classical cryptography rests on the notion of intractability, for example. So the ability to factorize large numbers, find elliptic curves, in the old days solve what was known as the knapsack problem. These kinds of things are intractable, and we rely on that fact to deter the other side from actually devoting the computing resources to solving that problem and therefore breaking into our code systems. So with the arrival of quantum cryptography, or quantum computing, I should say, that actually brings into risk everything that surrounds signatures, privacy and secrecy, obviously, and key distribution. So as a result, there actually has been a huge amount of resources devoted to designing post-quantum cryptography, quantum key distribution schemes, quantum cryptanalysis, which is, of course, very important from the cyber conflict perspective. But we could also ask ourselves which other areas within cyber conflict and cyber warfare, cyber security, are then amenable also to quantum computing. And there we have a number of other interesting things that haven't yet on a large scale been considered as candidates for this. And I'm thinking in particular about the design of malware, detection of malware, verification of software, optimizing the cyber battlefield, playing out game theory scenarios. So these kinds of things also require vast amounts of computing power and haven't otherwise been typically solved on a very, very large scale with classical computing, and potentially actually could be solvable with quantum computing. So that sets the stage for what we'd like to discuss this morning. I'd like to very briefly introduce everyone. I've actually got them in my head in alphabetical order, so I'm going to start with the gentleman in the middle, and that's Troy Lee. Professor Troy Lee comes to us from Singapore, where he's working for the Center for Quantum Technologies, and he also happens to have a professorship at Nanyang Technological University. And Troy has a specialization in algorithmics, quantum complexity, and of course, everything that surrounds that. On the end there, you'll see Professor Norbit Lutkenhaus, and Norbit comes to us from the Institute for Quantum Computing at the University of Waterloo in Canada, where he's also a professor in cryptography and things related. And Norbit has a specialization in quantum key distribution, quantum communications, and he's also involved, perhaps like many of us, as CTO and co-founder of a company called Evolution Q, which is working in this space. And last but not least is the gentleman next to me, and this is Professor Barry Sanders. And Barry is actually has a very nice longer title, but he's director at the Institute for Quantum Science and Technology, and also professor of physics at the University of Calgary, also in Canada. And his specialization is multifold, but one of the things that's particularly exciting is that he knows a tremendous amount about practical ways to build quantum computers and the current state of the art, which is presumably what he's going to be telling us about this morning. He also has adjunct positions at a couple of other universities around the world. So before I let them kick off, the format this morning is I'm going to have them each give roughly 5 minutes. They may, of course, go over that if they get excited, but roughly 5 minutes of an overview of their subfield and get us motivated, get a taste for the other person's work, and prepare to engage on some of the overlaps. And furthermore, during the session, I'll actually invite questions from the floor. So I'd like you to, even though it's the morning after the night before, I'd like you to actually devote a little bit of brain power to questions that you'd like to see answered and directions that you'd like to guide the discussion. And we'll take those roughly halfway through, if not a bit earlier. I realize that not everyone here has English as their first language. So we have a lot of patience for that. What I do, however, ask is that if you do ask a question, that you rather structure it as one or two key points as opposed to a sort of a multi-depth mega question that, of course, we'll have trouble memorizing and we'll have trouble getting back to. And then we'll be able to take one or two questions before we engage that topic a bit further. So without further ado, Barry, if you don't mind kicking off the discussion.
Thanks, Bruce. In 5 minutes, I answer 3 questions. What is a quantum computer? What can a quantum computer do? And what is the quantum computer made of? And for your information, I have a book I wrote last year, only 20 pages. It's free. It's online, published by the Institute of Physics, called Building a Quantum Computer. So you can read it if you like, and I don't get any income, so I'm not plugging it. The first question, what is a quantum computer? So at its heart, a computer, the computers we know and love, represent information as bit strings and represent logical processes in terms of Boolean logical operations such as AND, XOR, and NOT. We can extend this idea to what's known as reversible computing, which solves computational problems by permuting bit strings, and it could be run backwards to recover the input from the output. Quantum computing extends the notion of logically reversible computing to the quantum domain, which exploits what we call wave-particle duality. The quantum computer accepts a superposition of all possible inputs and deploys algorithms that exploit wave-like interference over the computational domain for a potentially significant improvement to computational performance. The second question, what can a quantum computer do? Well, a quantum computer could present 3 advantages. One, we believe that quantum computers offer loosely what we call an exponential speedup for the hidden abelian subgroup problem. One application of this problem is the ability to solve classical hard problems like factorization efficiently with an application to breaking public key cryptography. The second advantage of quantum computers is what we call amplitude amplification, and a key application is a quadratic speedup to the unstructured search problem, and that could be a threat to symmetric encryption. The third advantage of quantum computing is very speculative, but a major part of current investment, and this is in the area of quantum annealing, which seeks to speed up optimization problems that can be, and we formulate those as weighted max 2-sat problems, and we're trying to see whether quantum annealers could speed up solving such problems. The third question, what is a quantum computer made of? Well, we don't yet know if we can build a practical quantum computer that could solve important problems, and there are various contenders for the technology. The leading one at the moment is using cold superconducting circuits. Another leading contender is trapped ions. Ions are charged atoms, take electrons off and make them charged. And in third place, I would say, are photons, which are particles of light being sent through interferometers. Other opportunities are being studied carefully, such as ultra-cold atoms and lattices, and something known as Majorana fermions that could be realized in terms of a superconducting semiconducting interface. Currently, quantum computers operate with dozens of physical quantum bits and can make hundreds of quantum logical gates. In order to be scalable, they need error correction, and error correction, unfortunately, is not practical yet. That's what you need to know.
Thanks very much, Barry. So for all of the computer scientists and perhaps mathematicians in the room, I think this hits a number of things on the head. For those of you that don't come from that background, perhaps there were a number of terms in there that were absolutely Greek. So this is actually one of the reasons that we will shortly invite questions, because it's an opportunity for you to state your favorite problem, computationally hard and difficult problem, or something that you're intrinsically fearful of being solved by quantum computing. And very bluntly ask Barry if it's the kind of problem that is potentially solvable with quantum computers. But before we engage that, and we'll return to Barry in a moment as well, before we engage that, I'd like to actually turn it over to Troy to give us an overview of his work and potentially the algorithmics in this area.
Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to briefly share my thoughts on the impact that quantum computing can have on cryptography and security. So I think that there's no doubt that quantum computing is going to have a large impact on cryptography, and we're going to have to change our security infrastructure because of it. And I think the reason is very simple, and that's that large-scale quantum computers can break much of the public key cryptography that we use today, as Barry mentioned. So something like the HTTPS protocol that we use to secure traffic on the internet, it relies on cryptographic protocols such as RSA, elliptic curve cryptography, Diffie-Hellman key exchange. All three of these protocols are broken in the presence of a sufficiently large quantum computer. And the second point is that large-scale quantum computers are coming. So I think this is a less contentious statement as time goes on. I mean, there is a joke that, for the last 20 years, people have been saying that in 10 years we'll have a large-scale quantum computer. But now I think it's really true. And part of the reason is that the commercial interest in building quantum computing. So now IBM and Google have both produced like 50-qubit quantum computers. I think the competition between them is going to further drive development. The Chinese tech giants like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, they've all started to develop quantum research labs. And there's also several startup companies that are building quantum computers. So I think with this commercial interest, growing amount of money being invested in the development of quantum computing, we're going to continue to see the development probably accelerate in the next few years. So just to throw some numbers out there, right now, IBM and Google have quantum computers around 50 qubits. So last year we wrote a paper analyzing the threat of quantum computing to Bitcoin, and in particular to one particular cryptographic protocol that's used in Bitcoin. And so we estimated that to actually run these quantum algorithms, in this case it's a discrete log algorithm, you would need something like, when you take into account error correction and everything, something like 500,000 qubits. So today we're at 50 qubits. We'd probably need to get to something like 500,000 qubits to actually implement these algorithms. So that's like a 10,000-fold increase, but we're seeing something like a Moore's law for the increase in qubits in quantum computers. So doubling in the number of qubits, every 8 to 12 months. So we could really see that 10,000-fold increase, in a matter of, something like 9 to 13 years. Okay, so we have a bit of time, but I think it's not too early to start really preparing our cryptography for quantum computers. So I think the next question is really, what can we do? How can we prepare ourselves? So luckily, there is a lot of research into quantum secure cryptography. There's really two directions you can go in quantum secure cryptography. So one is where you actually use quantum devices, and you actually send quantum information between parties. So Norbit is an expert in that, so I'll let him talk about that. So the other direction is called post-quantum cryptography. So this is where you use classical protocols like we use today, but you use protocols whose security is based on problems that we believe are still hard to solve on a quantum computer. So a lot of times the way that you show a cryptographic protocol is secure is you show that if you can break that protocol, it means that you can solve a problem that we think that you cannot solve with current computational resources. So for example, RSA, if from someone's public key you can derive their private key, it means that you can factor a large number. So that's a problem that we think is hard classically, but not quantumly. But fortunately, there are other problems that we believe cannot be efficiently solved on a quantum computer. And people have devised cryptographic protocols based on these hard problems. So that's called post-quantum cryptography. And actually, NIST, the US National Institute of Standards and Technology, at the end of last year, they finished a call for proposals for post-quantum cryptography. So they received something like over 60 submissions for encryption algorithms, key exchange algorithms, signature algorithms. And now there's like a 3 to 5 year period of review and testing and attacking these algorithms. So hopefully in 5 years, they can come up with some standards of algorithms, cryptographic protocols that we believe can be are secure and secure against quantum computers. So I think that definitely we're going to have to change the cryptographic protocols that we use in the face of a quantum computer. But if we act now and we start early and we research these alternative cryptographic schemes, then we can roll out and change our infrastructure in time before a large-scale quantum computer can be developed, so that we can continue the kind of cryptographic functionality that we enjoy today, and probably also suffer from the same security problems that we have today. So even if we have these schemes that are mathematically we believe are sound, of course they'll still be subject to attack in their implementation in their hardware or on the users. Yes.
Thanks very much, Troy. I think we'll lead directly, especially given that you actually were talking already about cryptography. I think this is a perfect lead in to hear what Norbit's work and thoughts are in this field.
Right, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's directly to connect what Troy has been saying. We know in cybersecurity we have many issues to secure our systems. And now we can ask basically what happens once we have quantum mechanics, when we use quantum mechanics, we use quantum computers, what changes? Whereas the bad news is all problems we have now, we still will have afterwards, right? We just get one extra problem on top of it, right? So just on everything, all problems, just put one big one on top of it, and that is just, which really directly is attacking the cryptographic element. So far we have been always saying in all crypto security issues, cryptography is not the issue. In cybersecurity is, in the future it will be. That is really the big problem that we actually have to fight on, right? So public key cryptography as the central part is really the part that really has to change. As we said, basically RSA, Diffie-Hellman, all of those will basically go out of the window. We will have some schemes like symmetric encryption, like AES, which is not as vulnerable as we understand at the moment towards quantum computers, and basically we can as well think about new public key cryptography system based on different problems which might basically be able to replace the previous system. So one important thing is, I think, to understand as well that with this new problem over here, we have a timescale issue. And the timescale issue, yes, we do not have a quantum computer right away. We don't have it today. But that does not mean that we don't have a problem today. Because if all encryption we use today, if it's based on RSA, it can be basically decrypted in the future. Right? And the question is, we have to encrypt something today, we have to use methods today. And once a quantum computer is coming around, basically we can retroactively actually break that stuff again. So now is the question, of course, okay, we do research in post-quantum, but what actually does it mean? We have new algorithms, but they need to be tested. We don't have proof that the new algorithms are yet ready. Usually we do security proofs by trying it long enough to break it. And that is with quantum computers, but as well as the classical kind of attacks that we have it. And the thing is, that is something you cannot, in a way, not speed up. Right? Especially if you think about the number of people who actually know about how to do quantum computer attacks on that one is very small. Right? And so therefore, to do the new research into basically how quantum computer can break it is very difficult. So basically now, as Troy said, there are two directions. Right? It's basically on one hand, post-quantum, find new classical algorithms that hopefully are safe against quantum computers and work with that one. And the great thing, as Troy said, is that basically we can keep all the infrastructure that we have, right? All kind of features, including especially as well, very important, the digital signatures, right? That we can keep that one. The other thing is actually what we can do is actually use now quantum mechanics to help us to solve the problem that quantum mechanics created, and that is just quantum key distribution. So quantum key distribution is just a method where we use the rules of quantum mechanics to create secret key between two locations, right? And here the good thing is this is a method which actually has provable protocol security, right? But it comes with limitations. First, we have something about it's a point-to-point protocol, which we have somehow to lift up to a network protocol. It has a distance problem. The further you go, the more loss you have between stations, the harder it gets, right? And the rates as well as not keep up for kind of one-time pet encryption of modern communication speed. At the moment, we don't have it. So we need to work on those things. I think the important thing is, oh right, and then of course as well, we have side channels on those things, right? All implementation of QKD, of course, we need to be secure against side channels, right? So I think basically for us important is for the future, we need to figure out how the future cryptographic infrastructure will look like, and I'm quite sure we need first to do the post-quantum right away, because it's better to have a public key crypto system based on protocol which is not absolutely proven, rather than to use one where we know it will be cracked in the future. And then we have to think about what do we do about long-term security, where as well these methods we probably have to rely on something like quantum cryptography. The last point I want to make is, as we talk, for example, about quantum key distribution, which creates just point-to-point secret key enables more still than just a secret communication. It's not only about encryption, but you really can think about any kind of multi-party secure computation that might be, has much more application as well, that you can base on these secret keys. But for that one, I think that's for the opening statement, enough buzzwords.
Very, very nice. In fact, I wonder if I could just very quickly follow that up with a question then, especially given your last comment. I mean, does this tie in clearly with homomorphic encryption and the possibility for well, mutual secret computation being carried out, which of course solves a number of other problems in the cybersecurity world?
Well, the thing would be, the one that I alluded to is really in this secure multi-party computation is really something like distributed decision making. It's where you really say, you know, I have some function basically, for example, in the military context, I think the example that you would want to bring, right, you have a commander, you have to make decision based on information that is distributed around the globe. Right. So of course the simple way is bring all that information to the command center and then you make the decision. But of course then you're vulnerable. Right? All information sits in one location, can be attacked. Secure multi-party computation would be enable you actually to make that decision, right, the function of all those inputs, without bringing that information together in one location. Right? So the information resides where it was before. It's the only thing that is basically achieved globally is that you can come to your decision. Right? And so that is something which you can base on point-to-point secret key information, because it only needs secure communication between those locations and the channel. And so quantum key distribution could offer it, but you can as well think about any type of secret channel, which would be as well, for example, post-quantum cryptography would as well enable that one. Right? But this is a very important application, I think, as well. We have to think beyond just digital signatures and just secure communication.
Very nice, Barry.
I'll just add to it that, yeah, the quantum version of homomorphic encryption has become increasingly important, and there are two variants of it. There's blind quantum computing and quantum homomorphic encryption. One leads to information theoretic security, the other to computational security, and I mean quantum computational security. And there are experiments, really proof of principle experiments, happening now with some recent papers out in the past 2017, 2018. So it's considered a hot topic. It's also extremely expensive to operate. So there's one gate quantum logic gate that we need to operate to make things, to make the quantum computer exceed classical capability. And being able to do that gate in these schemes turns out to be very expensive. So that's currently a roadblock to practicality.
Okay, so presumably not in the end the kinds of roadblocks that are going to remain there. We can, of course, solve this in the long term with Moore-type progress. Many of you in the room actually may have already seen that this resonates with some of the problems that you face. So, for example, a homomorphic or distributed secret computation fits in very well with the notion that, for example, various nations need to actually share a certain amount of intelligence, threat intelligence in the cyberspace, and don't necessarily want to be able to have to share all of that directly with all of the other parties involved, but you'd like to actually have this kind of distributed decision-making in which you can take advantage of the global picture without having to share all of the details of what you've come across. So I think this should resonate with many people in the room. There are a few people I've talked to in the last days who see that as well. Before we continue too far down that pathway, and I'm happy to loop back to it, especially if there's some more interest, I'd like to maybe come back to Barry and just ask about the actual implementations of these things, because you ran through a short overview of where things are at right now. I think many people have been, for marketing reasons, probably exposed to companies like D-Wave, and we certainly don't want to pick on particular companies, but D-Wave, IBM, and various other companies are working in the quantum computer space. And there are people in this room, I think, who work for places that have bought D-Wave computers. But questions then arise as to, is this general quantum computing? Where's that going? Why is this then not a solved problem? Why are these things not shipping? And I think many of the things that you named make them sound particularly delicate, quantum computers in general. And if we look at a typical tough book that would be distributed with someone into the field, it doesn't sound like we're on the verge of having quantum computers that are that robust. So perhaps you can comment on maybe not D-Wave directly, but you're welcome to as well.
I can comment on anything.
Yeah.
Don't mind. So the way to think about the quantum computing commercial space is there are two directions. One we refer to as universal quantum computing, and it resonates with a lot of the discussion here at this meeting that computers, we're hearing a lot about computers can do anything, and this is a threat, for example, with respect to malware. The universal quantum computer is a quantum version of the Turing machine, where we can program the finite state machine. It can do anything. And this is the direction, I would say, IBM's online quantum experience, which I think is around 20 qubits now, represents that direction. So my understanding is that IBM is a good example of a company that is leading in that direction. D-Wave, Canadian company, was the earliest to go in a different direction, originally motivated by what was known as adiabatic quantum computing. It morphed into quantum annealing. Certain problems such as temperature come in, and they're looking for applications of their hardware that go beyond the quantum annealing direction. But I'll just pick quantum annealing as an example. And other companies are looking at this. Various countries are looking at it. And that direction, if the hardware problems can be solved and it can be scaled, then such computers would probably target what are regarded as NP-hard problems that relate to optimization. And so the goal there is to improve the performance on certain optimization problems to make them better. I don't think there was a time when some people were hoping that an NP-hard problem would become efficiently solvable. I think we've left that world behind. And so the idea is it could still be NP-hard, but if you have an exponentially hard problem and you make it exponentially better and it's still exponentially hard, you still have an exponential improvement. So this is the direction that people look at. Not a lot of theory behind it tells us where to look. So the way that D-Wave, I would say Rigetti, which is based in the Bay Area in California, San Francisco Bay Area, and various others are going, is they took their operating system, made it open source, make it available, and they're hoping that human agents trying to use their computer, benchmarking appropriately, will serendipitously discover a speed up. So that's what I would say is the direction that D-Wave spawned.
Very nice. Okay, so perhaps a follow-on question that relates to a little bit more of what Troy was talking about, and that is, do we have enough data points yet to really say that there's something that looks like Moore's law in showing us the trend in terms of number of qubits? And one of the things that I'd like to mention is we saw this morning in Luke's talk, the first talk, a very brief discussion about advances in semiconductors and the size of transistors. For those of you that were here for Thomas's talk first thing yesterday morning, he talked about, of course, this runaway complexity, the fact that transistors nowadays are getting so small that they actually all on their own, whether we like it or not, are displaying quantum behavior. And that's an unavoidable trend simply because of the size of transistors. So it's we're in the bizarre situation that in the classical computing world we're getting quantum effects that we don't want, and there's an uphill battle for making sure that we get wanted quantum effects up to scale quickly enough. And these are, of course, are two very different worlds: the let's say the engineering physics world and the traditional semiconductor field. So perhaps you can comment on where you see that going, or whether you.
Yeah, it's true that we don't actually have that many data points. So especially I think you probably have to take the data separately for the different approaches to building a quantum computer, like whether you're using ion traps or superconducting qubits, because those will probably grow at different rates. So for the particular number that I said earlier, something like 10 years, of course, there's a lot of assumptions that go into that number. The particular model that we were looking at were superconducting qubits, but there's only 4 or 5 data points to look at. So yes, of course, there is a lot of extrapolation in that. Right. But I think, maybe we'll get a better estimate, in the next couple of years.
Fair enough. Okay, we're roughly the halfway mark, so I'd like to invite any questions from the audience. And if you don't mind, because of the glare of the lights, if you could just stand up so that we can actually clearly see where you are, as opposed to hands going up. So we'll take, if we can have a microphone over to someone here at the front right, and also a microphone to the gentleman that stood up back there as well. So let's start at my front right. And if you could briefly state your affiliation, name and affiliation, if you're willing to.
Hi, I'm Christy. I'm a threat intel researcher at Accenture iDefense. Thank you for the panel. It's been really enlightening and quite accessible, surprisingly. And one area that I'm particularly interested in, I know you were saying that symmetric encryption is surprisingly resilient when you're looking at quantum attempts to defeat encryption. I wondered, if you could kind of expand a bit in terms of the effect of key size in symmetric encryption, because I'm aware that a lot of legacy, but also quite a lot of contemporary military comms hardware, due to hardware limitations, has symmetric. It uses symmetric encryption, but quite small key sizes. So, do you think that there's a realistic chance that that's going to have an operational impact, potentially all the way up to 128-bit AES encryption?
Okay, before we dive into that, I wonder if we could have the other question from whoever it was just next to the aisle there.
Yeah, that was me. Good day, Thomas Tallinn, Google Project Zero. I have 2 small questions. One would be the number of 500,000 qubits that are required to do the discrete log problem. Does that include overhead for error correction? And if not, how large would that overhead be? The second question is about post-quantum crypto, and we just heard about hardware limitations in actual real-world hardware. How high is the overhead for post-quantum asymmetric schemes as compared to current asymmetric schemes?
Thanks very much. Okay, let's start with Christy's question regarding asymmetric crypto. Any takers on that?
Yeah, maybe I can say something about. So for symmetric encryption, we have typically not the structure to do the exponential speed up in quantum computers like we do for public key, where we have the factorization problem. So we can basically do only something like Grover search, which is a square root improvement. So as a rule of thumb, you can say for your symmetric keys, you can expect, if there's no other handle that the quantum computer use, is basically effective half of the key size. Right, so if you start with AS256, it's basically roughly like 128 bits. Actually, there are some papers that looked a little bit more in detail, and then the thing is basically, I think it was 150 or so on, that you can argue it corresponds to 150 bits security of that. And that's just basically the lack of structure that the quantum computer attacked, because the quantum computer does not everything much better. You need some structure that the quantum computer has, and the symmetric one is basically only Grover at the moment that we know of that can help, right?
And can you maybe extend that to Thomas's question on needed overheads? Or, of course, there's another question hidden there in Thomas's discussion.
Yeah, the 500,000 number, that actually did take into account error correction overhead. So the particular scheme that we're analyzing there was like a 256-bit discrete log problem. So this is like what's used in the signature scheme in Bitcoin. So this is another interesting point. If you had a quantum computer that worked perfectly, so every qubit just stayed exactly in the state you put it in, and there are no errors on your gates, then actually to solve this 256-bit discrete log problem, you'd only need around 2,000 qubits. Okay, so actually this blowing up to 500,000, that's all the overhead of error correction. And of course, that's under certain assumptions about what your error rates are and everything like that. But we got those from data from superconducting qubit experiments. And then your other question was the overhead for post-quantum schemes. So I think there's another point why maybe people are reluctant to implement post-quantum cryptography before it's immediately necessary, or they see that they have to do it. And that's because post-quantum crypto schemes, they do tend to have like larger public key sizes. So again, I'm most familiar with signature schemes. So there's several post-quantum crypto signature schemes available. So Bitcoin, for example, uses an elliptic curve signature scheme, which is actually very efficient. So any post-quantum signature scheme would have an overhead of at least 20 to 50 times the size of the public key plus the signature length. Now, in an application like Bitcoin, that's extremely important because in a transaction, you have to give your public key and you have to give your signature. So that determines how much the size of a transaction. And of course, these transactions are packaged into blocks. Each block is like 1 megabyte. So the larger, and then you only have a block occurring every 10 minutes. So the larger these transactions are, the fewer transactions you fit into a block. So the slower the number of transactions per second you can do. And so in Bitcoin, it's already very slow, something like 7 transactions per second. So if you were to increase the transaction size by a factor of 10, you're hurting your transaction speed by a factor of 10. So that's one reason why I think in practice there's some reluctance to implementing now these post-quantum crypto schemes. But I think that's something that's really nice about the cryptocurrency world, is that now we have hundreds and hundreds of different cryptocurrencies, and they're kind of exploring this space of cryptography. So there actually are several coins that are using post-quantum digital signatures in their cryptocurrency. And I think that's very neat that already these are being tested in the wild with tens of millions of dollars at stake. So I think this is a very good testing ground for some post-quantum cryptography.
Norbit.
Yeah, I think basically as well something regarding the overhead. There is as well a project which is called Open Quantum Safe, which is organized by colleagues of mine, Mike Mosca and Douglas Sibilla. So that's really a kind of community-based part, including Microsoft and many other players in there, where indeed it's just like I have reference implementations of all the post-quantum algorithms, which is really a good compilation as well, where one try out these different kind of ways and see how they perform. So there are more of a literature indeed that offers this kind of performance comparison, again, against the length of the key, but as well as something about latency and how fast those things are.
Very nice. And if I could also just summarize your answer regarding Christie's question, Norbit. In summary, so tactical communication, typically used in the military and various other contexts. Obviously, it doesn't have a need for long-term secrecy. And quantum computing really doesn't pose a threat at this point.
Well, yeah, the only thing is of that one is, of course, you have an overall system, right? And the question is basically is always, when does the clock start to tick? Right? If I use symmetric encryption, or, well, how do you get the key for your symmetric encryption? So what is the whole infrastructure behind it? And I think that is something we really have to analyze carefully, right? So really, what is this stuff for the overall infrastructure? What really depends on what, right? Because again, there's just one component, right? You say, oh, this looks safe, but unfortunately, it might actually rely on many other steps before that if they blow away, then you suddenly are left with nothing, right? So it's very important, I think, to analyze the system, really dig very, very deep in your systems to figure out what is your quantum vulnerability, right? And so, and sometimes, you look at it, you first think, oh, I'm fine, and then you really say, oh, man, yeah, there was this step, right? So that's something you have to find out, actually.
So maybe that connects directly with something Barry can actually tell us something about. There have been some very impressive demonstrations in the recent past regarding long-distance key distribution, and some of them have been known openly. Of course, the Chinese experiments, which are orders of magnitude further than the previous experiments. And I think I'd like you to comment on that. Just before we move to that, sorry, just in my field of view, we have Rod with a question. please.
Yeah, thank you for picking up on this issue of the post-quantum keys. You know, software is expensive to develop, software is slow to develop, and as we learned in Y2K and other transition points, it's really hard to go back and re-engineer and refactor. So if one is building systems, I mean, a Bitcoin has a lot of artificial constraints, a 1 megabyte block, you know, incredibly slow. And I'm a Bitcoin miner, so I'm very familiar with the technology. But you know, it has a lot of artificial constraints. But in other software systems, if where you're not worried about memory space so much, and you're not worried so much about bandwidth, okay, would you, if you were designing new systems today, use those new post-quantum definitions, or would you use those key sizes and signature sizes times 10 or 100? I mean, what would you do if you wanted to design a software system where you wanted the crypto to work for, say, the next 20 years, given where things are likely to evolve, given the panel's experience?
I think basically one of the things is first you need crypto agility in your systems, so that we don't come into a situation again that we are now. So we cannot just swap out RSA against something else, right? So it's not agile. Then the other thing is as well, since we have the situation that the new post-quantum algorithms are basically in a way still in the test phase, we should still explore them, right? You would probably not want to rely on one particular scheme, but you would actually do basically several back on back, right? So that you have to break several of those schemes, right? Just in case that one of them has even a kind of classical vulnerability, right? Then the estimate about what key sizes we need, basically even in the presence of a quantum computer, so people have been doing some calculations about what you would expect in key lengths that you would need to have for the various.
And what is that?
Actually, I don't know those numbers myself, and the things, but the things you really have, because it really depends on what of these algorithms you use, right?
Yeah, so to add to that, you know, I'd say one thing that about post-quantum cryptographic schemes, we also have to worry about their classical security, right? So, you know, if you go ahead and implement one today, then yeah, you might be protected against quantum computers in 10 years, but you also have to worry about your classical security today. So, you know, something like RSA, it's been around for 40 years, and, you know, people have been trying to attack it for 40 years, and a lot of these post-quantum schemes, they've been around a lot less time. So probably if I were going to implement something today, I might actually you know, just build a redundant system where I was using both something that we believe in today and at the same time, you know, post-quantum scheme. And actually, Google did a test like this for securing traffic with their servers. So they used a post-quantum key exchange algorithm called New Hope, but jointly, you know, using elliptic curve or, you know, whatever else that they're doing today, they use both at the same time, just so that if the post-quantum scheme was hacked, they would still have the security of the elliptic curve one.
Good. Barry, I wonder if you could dive in with what we were beginning to touch on there with long-distance quantum key distribution. I'm thinking in particular about, for example, the experiments in China. So there, you know, the satellite uplink experiment, the long-distance, admittedly, experiment involving secure repeaters. But is this state of the art right now? And are there other parties that are on the verge of doing similar things? Other schemes that that show promise as well?
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to discuss that. So the, you know, the quantum key distribution, as we've been hearing, is an important approach. You know, we have the post-quantum crypto and we have the quantum key distribution as two alternatives to deliver security meeting different requirements. So these experiments have been done for decades, and typically follow two directions. One is free space communication. So there'd be transmitter and receiver. Until recently, the best example was the Canary Islands with 144-kilometer transmission, and you'll typically put transmitter and receiver on tops of high mountains to get as little absorption through the air as you can. The other direction is to send stuff through optical fibers, and then optical fibers have some particular loss rate, but certainly for citywide and city-to-city communication, optical fibers have advantages. But a couple of years ago, China launched a quantum satellite that's called Misius, named after, I think, a contemporary of Confucius, one of the great philosophers. And that one was a game changer. So last year, there was a demonstration of quantum teleportation, quantum key distribution, at 1,200 kilometer separation. So these are unreachable without using satellite-based. The trick of using the satellite is that you're communicating with an object out in space, and so the amount of air that the signal has to go through is reduced. The technological advantages are, technologically it's actually a risky effort. The European Space Agency had a plan on the books. China proceeded with an effort that involved very little testing and just kind of hope, and it worked. And then there are various elements to it, how to track using GPS to know where it's going to be. So there's a lot of technicalities involved. Now the satellite is used for communication between places. So there's, in Austria, in Graz, there's a base. And so there's a communication link going between China and Europe. And then from Austria, there's ground-based links extending outward. And there is a plan that China has to launch a network of quantum satellites, presumably to reach a global scale quantum communication network. Other countries, I've had conversations with people who are discussing satellites. I think there will be quantum satellites launched, but these aren't really discussed in the public domain.
Well, some of them actually are. So we have, for example, Brady in Canada, right? So we have indeed a project to launch a QKD satellite in Canada. And then the same thing is in many other countries. Actually in Europe, the European Space Agency has a whole program called Skylight, where indeed the way is forward to explore, to have a cloud of QKD satellites with several ground stations actually to be able to provide services based on QKD. So that is something which is as well pushed forward. But as usual, it needs someone else to go first. And why? Because Europe, many other countries had those plans before that, where, as Barry said, slowly developing them. But nothing motivates as much as having, in China, it being done and demonstrated, right? And now suddenly we say, oh, we should do this as well, right?
Very good argument for agile development as well.
Yeah.
Let's open the floor to another couple of questions. I see one over there, someone already standing, and if we could bring another microphone around to this colleague. And so let's start over there, please.
Edward Sobies from the Army Cyber Institute. Thank you for the excellent presentation, very wonderful. Two quick questions. Could you elaborate any further on who might be exploring the implications involving quantum computing being used with machine learning? And then secondly, is there any possibilities that the true impact of quantum computing might be outside the realms that you're talking about? Sometimes technologies are evolving and we think they're going to be used for one thing and they end up being used for something else. Are there any surmising on your part of something that we haven't talked about that might be the true impact of quantum?
Okay, so before you jump into that, let's please take the question from the colleague here in the near field.
Yeah, sure. My name is Brady. I'm a consultant from New York City. And what I'm looking for from you guys for my question is just sort of like we got from Schneier and Julian yesterday. It's just sort of like a rough, are you optimistic or pessimistic? What's the timeline like? And thinking of, should we be as, do you think it's going to be as disruptive as shooting electrons through transistors ended up being from a physics standpoint, right? This paradigm shift in counterintelligence, in military conflict, in our economies, in our democratic institutions. Do you see as radical a shift happening with quantum as traditional computing brought about?
Okay, very nice question. That actually would have been my closing question as well, so thanks very much for stating that. And I wonder if we could please go to whoever it was on the left side of the aisle that has a microphone.
Yes. Ricardo Subillas with Armed Forces. Both application of quantum that were discussed today imply or use entanglement or the spooky effect of Einstein to do what they do. Now mankind gets its first automatic finger to handle quantum entangled states in a reproducible way with this applications. But theories and experiments today shows that entangled states not just can be moved around space, but also can survive accelerations, thus survive travel through time. So aren't we just on the brink of mind-blowing application for quantum technologies? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. In fact, let's leave it at that for a moment. I'd like to actually wrap that one up, the potential for mind-blowing applications. We'll wrap that up with Brady's question, and we'll take that actually in the last 2 minutes as closing commentary from you three, if that's okay. So I'd like to come back to then this question about quantum computing and machine learning, for example. Barry, if you'd like to.
Sure. Naturally, so quantum is a hot topic and machine learning is a hot topic, so there's a lot of work that deals with the intersection between the two. Some of it is credible and some is, more, I don't buy into some of the arguments, but I'll try to give you an idea about it. So certainly, for machine learning of the supervised and unsupervised learning type, there's different applications. One is of the Grover search variety, which hopes to exploit unstructured search to try to find ways to speed up in machine learning, and there's literature on a potential quadratic speed up for machine learning applications. The details still have to be worked through. The other direction is to exploit what's known as a linear equation solver. So this emerged in work from Haro, Hasidim, and Lloyd at MIT a decade ago, and the concept is that by exploiting a capability of quantum computing to simulate quantum evolution, so to simulate how quantum systems behave, and recognizing that quantum dynamics is described by a second-order differential equation, there was a recognition that if a quantum computer can serve to simulate quantum mechanics, it could have applications to other, just any appropriate differential equations and correspondingly algebraic equations. This led to a linear equation solver, and the question then is whether this linear equation solver could speed up other applications like regression analysis for machine learning. Unfortunately, the linear equation solver has very tight requirements on it. There's something known as a condition number when you solve algebraic equations, and the growth of the condition number is very restrictive. So there's still a lot of question marks on it. Yes, there are companies going in this direction, so I'm just trying to remember all of them. I can think of 1Qubit in Vancouver. There's a company, I forgot the name, set up in Boston by students of Alan Asper-Guzik, who's at Harvard, but migrating to the University of Toronto this summer. There's a company called Xanadu in Toronto, and there's many others. I just can't remember offhand. But the question of whether quantum computing could be advantageous to machine learning, I just gave you the two directions people look at, and there's a lot of question marks and a topic of a lot of research at the moment.
Very nice. Norbit.
Yeah, just one extra comment. Indeed, there's one thing which will not the motivation to build a quantum computer, and that's actually breaking public key crypto, because just the mere fact that you could means that no one will use public key crypto that can be broken by the quantum computer. So that's not the sales argument, I think, for the development of that. Indeed, the applications of quantum computers will be really, the broad application will be in the other fields, like Barry just mentioned.
Right, right. As said, we're going to leave some of the other questions for the very end. I'd like to actually just prod you in a slightly different direction, because you mentioned now some other interesting problems that are solvable with quantum computing. And at the very beginning, Barry, you mentioned a number of satisfiability type problems. So many other things that appear in cybersecurity involve, whether people know it or not, satisfiability, so the ability to take a look at device drivers and explore that, or operating system kernels, explore those for vulnerabilities. So this is actually potentially developing new malware or detecting and knowing what to patch. So that would be one kind of satisfiability problem that we can, of course, solve nowadays at huge cost. Things along the lines of game theory, so these also have applications in cyber warfare. Have any of you thought about, to what extent these things, which in some ways can be cast as optimization problems, can then be solved in that other non-universal class of quantum computers? Or is that very much a dead end and we should rather focus on the use of quantum for cryptography?
Well, not necessarily a dead end, but it's a difficult thing, right? Indeed, because remember, quantum computers need some structure that they can grab into, right? And if you don't have that structure, the quantum computer is not just much faster than a general classical computer. Right? It does not provide an all-purpose speed up. It needs particular structures that they can grab in and do something. For sure, in these kind of simulation things where you do like quantum chemistry, doing calculations which are just hard, because the space that we need to represent physical systems on a classic computer gets really difficult, while of course representing a quantum mechanical physical system on a quantum computer is something very natural, because they're the same type of systems. So that are different things. So for what you mentioned, I'm not sure basically how I would attack it, but maybe Barry does.
Yeah, I have a comment. I mean, it goes back to what you just said, and I mentioned in my opener about weighted max 2SAT. So we know that satisfiability problems are a theoretical underpinning for a lot of these interesting questions. I agree with Norbert that we need to find structure, but this is a space of problems that we don't really understand very well, and we don't know if there is or is not some speed up. That's why I mentioned that companies are going open source, letting people use the computer and trying to devise benchmarks to look for a speed up. So the answer to the question, I think, is that we need to do a lot of work on mapping those kinds of problems into the theoretical framework of satisfiability, max KSAT, weighted max, put it in that form, and then maybe there is structure to the problems. So some people argue about tall, thin barriers for optimization. So instead of simulated annealing where you vary a temperature, maybe there's a quantum tunneling. This is kind of just the imagination at work, but we need to really study these problems in detail to see if we can find the kind of structure that Norbert is saying we would need to exploit quantum computing.
So
okay, I think we're almost, sorry.
Just one more
Troy.
comment. Yeah, so, I mean, for satisfiability, I mean, we do know that there actually is some quantum speed up. So, there are some more sophisticated classical algorithms than just, trying all possibilities to see if there's a satisfying assignment. And quantum algorithms can fairly generically actually speed up those more sophisticated classical algorithms by a quadratic factor. So not this kind of exponential speed up that we're talking about with problems like factoring, but just a quadratic speed up. So that's kind of what I would expect. You would have a modest speed up, but probably not make a problem that's completely intractable, classically feasible quantumly when you look at something like SAT or these NP-hard problems.
Okay, so before we close that off, one of the things that I don't think we're going to have time to actually discuss properly right now would be the notion of how to actually attack a quantum computer. So of course, anyone involved in cyber conflict will eventually start to think about, if someone else has a quantum computer, how do I go about tackling that? And maybe in your closing comments, each of you could comment on that. But given the fragility of quantum computers right now, it seems almost as easy as getting a laser in there or disrupting the HVAC system or shaking it or doing something like that. So this kind of chronic fragility might work on behalf of the attacker, shall we say. So you can take that along. In the last little while, I wonder if I could have each of you take 30 seconds to maybe just address the last couple of questions that we got. So the questions were basically, are you optimistic? That was a very short summary of Brady's question. We had another question about these notions of entanglement. Are we not about to see crazy things that also connect with the first question asker? Crazy things that are far beyond what the predictions, what's the probability that the outcome is far beyond this? And lastly, of course, the name of this session. Is this the security game changer? Barry, if we can start with you.
Sure.
Having,
That's a lot to answer.
and keep yourself to 30 seconds, 40 seconds.
Is it a game changer? My view is that the game of cryptography and cryptanalysis goes back millennia. And so it's the same game, we just have shiny new tools. So we can't ignore them, and we'll see where they're going to go. Am I optimistic or pessimistic? Well, that's a function of which side you're playing on. Am I optimistic we're going to break into everything, or am I optimistic we can defend against it? Really, it's early in the stage. We're seeing, and this is Troy highlighted, we're seeing progress. So I am optimistic that we are going to see progress in the field. Things are going to get better. Whether we reach the threshold condition that these turn into a threat or opportunity is open. And are we going to see something mind-blowing? This is the great unpredictable in all of science. Famous Lord Kelvin said in the 19th century that all the questions in physics had been answered, and then suddenly relativity and quantum came along. So I think that as we explore the boundaries of quantum systems, and those of us who work in the field don't really believe in it, because there's fundamental philosophical paradoxes. I'm hoping that my mind is blown while I'm still on this earth. Thanks.
Troy.
Okay, so is it a game changer? I guess I exactly agree with Barry. I think that, yeah, the game will continue. We'll have new cryptographic protocols, new kinds of attacks, but we'll probably still have, more or less the same cryptographic functionality that we have today, the same kind of security issues that we have today, with new pieces in the game, but the game continues. Optimistic or pessimistic? So, actually I also work on showing lower bounds, so showing the limitations of quantum computers. So I guess algorithmically, I tend to be a little bit pessimistic. I mean, I think that certainly quantum computers will enable speed up for lots of problems, but I think in general, we should expect modest speed ups. Of course, you do have these remarkable things like this algorithm for factorization, which is quite incredible, and this algorithm for solving linear systems of linear equations, which could also have a lot of promise. So I'm maybe on the pessimistic, cautiously optimistic side. I think that there's still a lot of research to be done, and I think there's still a lot to discover about the power of quantum computing.
Thanks, Norbit.
Yeah, so is it a game changer? I think let me look back to what I said at the very beginning. In the cryptographic context, I think it's a game changer in the sense that we really have to think about cryptography again. And we have to think about it really in a different way, because we have to think something really far enough in the future, because we need to change our system and replace it by what? It's not a simple patch of any kind. So in that thing, basically that's the new addition. But otherwise, quantum computing, I think indeed the impact will be outside of the field of cryptography. That's really where really the quantum computer will has or the impact. The question, will my mind be blown away by future things? More definitely yes. Knowing my mind, I would say it will be. So I think indeed we will see quite a bit of changes in the future that we don't even anticipate at that moment.
Very good. We've gone a tiny bit over time. I'd like you to please just stay seated while we switch to the organizers. And none of our panelists are taking a flight immediately after this, so I'd encourage you to engage them in the coffee break if you have questions that we didn't get to. So thanks very much to my panelists.